Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, October 23rd, 2020. Time for yet another show. It's Friday. That's nice to hear from time to time. I don't know. Some weekends have... the weekend is coming back. I guess maybe it's excitement in anticipation of the upcoming election, and we're finishing out the week before the last week of the election season, and so it feels like it might finally be coming to an end. That makes it somewhat exciting. Trump hasn't been playing golf on the weekends lately, either because of, I don't know, lingering effects of COVID-19, or he's actually busy for once in his life, reminding himself that he needs to campaign for re-election. If he's going to make his attempt to steal office look like it could possibly be valid, he's going to have to get out there and do something that looks like a traditional campaign. So he's been busying himself with that. Instead, I assume the golf starts again after the election, and then he'll drive us all crazy over the weekends with various rage tweets, etc., etc. I don't anticipate too much is going to change. Debate last night. Well, we'll see what Ian Reifowitz has to say about it. I didn't get to watch much of it. Very little of it, really. Even less than I think the other debates and town halls, but of course observing afterwards and a little bit during on Twitter. But I was actually wrapped up in the taking the COVID-19 snapshot around the world and around the country for that day, and found that much more interesting than the debate. But this is the one that Trump partisans can pretend he won, apparently. I guess Megyn Kelly is fairly sure that he won overwhelmingly, and that Biden wasn't even a presence on the stage last night, and Trump was so substantive. I guess the play was to try and play off of the fact that the microphones could be turned off so that you couldn't shout over one another, and that I guess he didn't want anybody to see that coming into play. No one wanted to see allow him to see or allow people to see him be punished for breaking the rules of the debate by having his microphone shut down while he was on camera mouthing words. And so I guess they trained him real hard to not to do too much of that interrupting, not to get the penalty of having the microphone turned off be obvious against him. And so everybody said, well, he's much more restrained. There was even somebody who floated the idea during the debate on Twitter that this was, a new Donald Trump who had been well disciplined here, and here he was finally becoming president on like the last day of his term before the election. And it was actually pretty well flushed by the rest of the punditry who happened to be watching on Twitter. I don't think anybody really bought that, so that's kind of good news. The most dedicated Trump partisans went out and did what they're supposed to do, spin the debate. But other than that, no, not much in the way of change from what was expected. The highlights and lowlights that made it through, to me anyway, via the Twitter filter, a couple of shots taken by Biden that appeared to have landed when, of course, Trump went to his old standby of, I'm the least racist person. This time it was the least racist person in the room. And then he made some kind of comment that he's looking around like he couldn't see the audience, and the seating area of the audience was dark, like he was going to check. Would somebody wearing a bigger racist than you hat, or I'm less racist than you hat? So I have to honor what's on a hat, right? So you can't... I don't know. It was kind of a goofy thing, and then I guess Biden hits him back with the Abraham Lincoln over here, as he's so not racist. It's just great. It's fantastic. So anyway, a couple of barbs exchanged, a couple of foolish utterances by Trump, a pile of lies as usual. I guess he also spent what turned out to be the evening of a record-setting report for new cases in the United States. It was like 77,000 something new cases reported, and he, of course, spent the evening saying it's disappearing, it's going away, we've turned a corner. The same old lines as we, break all records. We're finding more cases per day than we did during the early spring peak, even when everybody thought everybody was going to get it and drop dead within minutes. So, not really in keeping with the experience of coronavirus around the country, or around the world for that matter, and any number of other ridiculous exchanges. I also understand very insidery debate from Team Trump. They allowed him to, of course, he was going to use every opportunity to level bizarro charges against Joe Biden, some of which we actually know about and have been debunked, others which are only still exclusively rattling around inside the really, tight-knit circle of the right-wing nutosphere, and have not even trickled down. None of the catchphrases or references or names or accusations that he was able to offer in shorthand in 2-minute bursts resonated with anybody. No one has heard of these things. The vast majority of America doesn't have any idea what he was talking about. And quite honestly, a number of political junkies that we know had no idea. And we try very hard to keep up with what's the latest in super crazy things that they're making up on the other side, so that we can, I don't know. So part of it is, of course, defense, but part of it is I'm just curious whenever they make ridiculous accusations that sound so utterly impossible. I am just curious about what the germ of truth that might once have been part of the real factual record. What was it that they picked up on and distorted, and how they do it? Because that's sometimes as funny as the initial reveal of something ridiculous, and you get an extra laugh out of it. But here they outpaced us on this one, and raised issues that only Fox News trained news junkies would recognize, and some of them might have outpaced some of what they were working on. They were bringing out all the fresh stuff, and it just doesn't work in this debate format. That was the general agreement, I think. And there's much more, of course, to distill out of it. We'll see how closely Ian Reifowitz observed events last night. I guess the other big line out of the night was, I guess at some point, I'm not even clear, was it Joe Biden making a reference to what everybody figures was supposed to be the Proud Boys, since that came up in their last live debate, during which they were both in the same room, and it came out mistakenly as Poor Boys, which apparently cracked everybody up, and then made the Proud Boys angry. It was a good trolling moment. If it was a mistake, it was a beneficial mistake. Sounds like it went over pretty well, and everybody kind of enjoyed it. And, anything that sticks it to them is fine by me. All right, let's try. Why don't we give Ian a call just now and see if we can't pick up on what his themes for the day from the debate might have been. And at the ready, Ian Reifowitz. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh, why can't I stop you?
There's no stopping me.
I'm trying to stop you on my phone.
Yeah, well, I'm a powerful force, apparently.
Oh my God, you overpowered the iPhone there. No, mostly you overpowered my poor thumb work.
Okay.
Here I am.
Well, I won the thumb war, so that's important too. Okay. Hey, good morning. I was just sort of going over what I was able to glean from debate Twitter, because I was just unable to sit down and watch this thing. Were you an active viewer of last night's debate?
I devoted a solid 3 hours, because I took a power nap in the afternoon after getting up very early to work. So I was ready, and I watched the whole debate, and I watched a full hour and a half of post-debate coverage, because I wanted to see at least one of the post-debate polls before I went to bed. So
well, that's great.
I am as well-versed as necessary. I will say that I really enjoyed Joe Biden's attempt to win the all-important swing constituency in New Orleans. by making a shout out to the po' boy sandwich.
Yeah, I guess that's what came to mind for me. It must have been. I guess if you're going to slip, that's the way it would go.
Yeah.
So
It's
hey,
nice fried shrimp in a sort of a hero type role, which one can get in New Orleans and feel like a local. And I think that's
ah,
really where Biden was headed.
I guess so. I mean, I don't know. It makes about as much sense as the name Proud Boys, certainly. Yeah, that's I think if it wasn't calculated, it's just that much more fun. If
Right.
it was, yeah, great. Good trolling. It's exactly the sort of thing that would bother them. It makes no sense whatsoever that it would bother them, but it does. So.
Well, it makes no sense that black people bother them either, but there you go.
Well, yeah, that's true. All right. Well, once we're off the sense radar, I guess anything can happen. I saw somebody do some graphics work coming up with a shareable Poor Boys meme, taking their logo, and like I remember last time there was the face to face ish debate. They, of course, were so pleased with his message to them of stand back, stand by, stand up, stand whatever he told them, and they incorporated that into their logo very quickly, circulating it on the internet. And guess what? The Poor Boys moved just as quickly, and this time it really upset them. This makes me so mad.
Oh
Well,
boy. Well, Joe Biden, he's an expert at trolling.
I guess so. So, all right, that was those were the highlights that made it through to me as someone who did not watch, and that's about as important as it's kind of a snap poll of the rest of America, which said, "Oh God, debate, forget it." But I don't know. I don't know how the ratings were. I'm sure Donald Trump is on top of that. He's the last guy in America to whom that matters. And but I'm glad that you got a thorough watch at it. What did you learn in the post debate analysis? Anything strike you?
I mean, I don't know if you shared the results already, but there were four
I did not.
real polls as opposed to just sort of open to whoever wants to sign in on the interwebs. But four real polls, and they all had Biden winning. They all, it was 51, 52, 54, something like that for Biden in each of the polls, and somewhere around 40 for Trump, which might well mirror the electorate period at this point, which would be great, a 12 to 14 point win. The one that I focused on more was CNN's, because I was the first one that came out. They said that their voter sample was basically even in terms of party ID. I think there was maybe 1% more Democrats than Republicans, but that's actually a more Republican sample than the national, the national statistics, which are typically 3 to 5% more Democratic in terms of party ID. So in a sense, this was a more Republican sample than usual. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it was also a sample of debate watchers. So who knows? But given that, and the fact that Biden won it, I believe 53 to 39, it's a pretty solid result for Biden. More unscientifically, they also had 11 undecided North Carolina voters, and they polled them after the debate, and 9 of the 11 said that Biden won, 0 said that Trump won, and 2 went with the ever popular draw.
Okay, sure.
Look, I don't have anything earth shattering. I think Biden did fine. I will say, if you want to start with the nervous Democrat, the part that got me nervous was when Trump towards the end did hammer on about Biden. Well, why didn't you do this? You say you're going to do this. Why didn't you do this? The 47 years, the 8 years as vice president. Yeah, that got me a little nervous, because I don't know if it triggered members of 2016 when outsider Trump was able to pull this off. But I got nervous. Biden was all right in his responses to that. Towards the end, he finally, he said, well, we had a Republican Congress.
Right.
I mean, there were better answers. I put myself in Biden's position, earlier in the debate when the moderator asked why there wasn't another relief package, and Trump said, well, Nancy Pelosi won't go along. There's your, Biden could have later on said, well, right, for the exact same reason you're complaining that you can't get another COVID package through because you don't like what Nancy Pelosi is doing. That's how governing works. Just because I wanted to do something as president doesn't mean I was able to do it instantly. Right. You look at your own remarks on the COVID package. If I am elected president and if I get a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic House, and those Democratic senators are smart enough to go along with me, then fine. But then I'll be able to do this. But the point of the debate is not what it's what I plan to do now versus what you plan to do now. So there were better answers he could have given, but ultimately it doesn't appear that is going to have changed too many people's minds. So maybe it won't be a problem. I can't imagine that many people, but I just felt it sort of intellectual. Like, come on, there's an answer there, Joe. Yeah. He gave it to you earlier in the debate. But
that's a good point.
Other than that, I really think Biden was better than Trump last night. Forget about expectations. Forget about not setting himself on fire. I think if this was the first time you had ever seen Joe Biden and Donald Trump debate, and you had no knowledge of their histories as candidates or previous debates, I think you would walk away saying that Biden did better. He had specifics. For anyone who was paying attention, there were a couple of times when the moderator asked Trump, "What would you do going forward on X?" One was COVID, for example, right. And Trump only looked backwards. He really had very little, to say about what he would do going forward. I think the final question was fairly telling. What would you say to those? Oh, yeah. And I think you've seen this before with him. What would you say to those who didn't vote for you? He had almost nothing addressing that at all. He just talked about what a great job he had done. Biden took a couple of digs and then said, "This is this is how I would address them." So I think Biden won the debate. I think that's what the polling shows. We're now 10 days out. The Hunter Biden is not going to be but her emails. There's no there. People, when they hear Trump say something, they discount it, other than the Trumpers themselves. So unless it's confirmed independently, which it has not been, there's not going to be any Hunter Biden story there. Brilliant to bring up Giuliani and troll Trump with that, throw him off his game. And the simple fact is that, if nothing else, the release of the Sacha Baron Cohen Borat movie today is only going to extend the Giuliani story, and thus make the Hunter Biden lies seem even less credible.
Well, yeah, that's some good timing, certainly. I like that's happening, and I guess America will spend the weekend debating whether or not Rudy Giuliani was really just tucking in his shirt, as he and President Trump both insist. But the fact that you're down to the last week of the campaign season. If the president of the United States, incumbent president, his closing argument is he was tucking his shirt in, not fondling himself, you're not really going to make any headway with people at the polls with that. I don't think.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I always tuck my shirt in lying flat on my back on a bed with a young girl.
Yes, it's infrequently done, but I don't know. Maybe it's a cultural difference between.
Well, it does evoke the Edwin Edwards maxim, right? The only way I can lose is if I'm found in bed with is it a live boy and a dead girl? And I don't think Borat's part of it, but I think we can stretch it just a bit. To say that this does not help the president of the United States.
No, not much. Well, you see how much it doesn't hurt. It's a Giuliani problem, and I'm sure he'll deal with it accordingly. But everyone can spend the weekend speculating on it now that the footage is out, instead of relying on the stills. So an exciting weekend for all in store. I did see that last bit of the debate, the very last, I guess the last minute of it, that the question put to them was, what would you say in your inaugural address? If you've won this election, you're giving your inaugural address, what do you say to the people who didn't vote for you? I thought that was an interesting part of the setup, because Trump does, as he does with many questions, ignored the premise of the question. But it seemed particularly ridiculous because, of course, the question had just been put. He was the first to answer, and it was pretty specific, and it wasn't a very long answer. There wasn't time to forget what the question was. So, if you take him literally rather than just seriously, his second inaugural address would be a campaign speech about why you shouldn't vote for Joe Biden, which, of course, would already have happened, but maybe he's safeguarding against a 2024 bid by Biden, either against himself or Ivanka or whoever he sets up as his successor. So, a little bit of a senior moment for him there. But I guess he used every opportunity for every question was just turned into, I have this attack I want to make, not an infrequently used debate tactic, but somewhere in there, usually debate prep, especially for a sitting president, is, well, okay, well, why don't you're going to need some statistics to sound like you're knowledgeable on a issue of policy. Memorize these things, and then even if they don't ask you about it, turn the debate to it and spit those out. But he's kind of incapable of retaining those facts, I think. And, so we all got the debate we expected out of him. Speaking of the weird references that he made and the attacks that he was launching being sort of ineffective because they hadn't yet percolated out to the rest of the country, he apparently brought another special guest with him to the debate. I guess this was supposed to be like another stunt where he brought previous Bill Clinton accusers to his debates with Hillary Clinton, except this time they made this announcement ahead of time that they were bringing this guy, and everybody, except Fox News and Rush Limbaugh listeners, said they had no idea who this guy was. He was not a recognizable face. No one had heard his name. I'm not even sure what the accusation was. I was able to piece together that he was a former business associate of Hunter Biden's, whose big accusation was that they were stealing money from all over the world and that Joe Biden was in on it and he was personally going to reap profits from whatever this deal was, even though it never came together. And apparently that's falling apart as well. There's a couple of stories this morning trying to explain who is this guy who showed up in the debate hall trying to command attention from the press and not getting any because no one knew who he was. I guess that ended up being a sideshow. A sideshow to the sideshow, really, was who is this guy and why would a sitting president waste the opportunity to bring someone real and substantive? But I don't know. Were you able to figure out anything about who this guy was or even remember his name?
That's the first I'm hearing of this.
See, there you go.
But, and it reminds me of another sort of lost opportunity for Trump, which is, he made, this Hunter Biden thing is obviously ridiculous, but, he's talking about Biden having houses. The idea of Trump saying, Biden has a bunch of houses. Please.
Okay.
But what he could have done is he could have said, well, listen, Joe Biden spent, first couple of years after he left the White House making paid speeches to corporate audiences and, a sort of a reviving of the attack on Hillary Clinton. And that, if he had any strategic sense, he could have said, maybe that would peel off some of the Bernie people. First of all, it has the advantage of being factual. Joe Biden did make those speeches. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, with making those speeches. It's a matter of what policies you promote, and that Joe Biden has a record. But that at least would have, wouldn't have been a journey into sideshow Bob land. But he doesn't do that. He just goes into the making up stuff. Biden was just much more real. There was a question about environmental racism. The moderator said, what would you say to families of color who were, close to, because it was a tangent from the energy question, right? Families of color who live near oil fields, and et cetera, blah, blah, blah. So Trump had no idea, literally no idea. So, I don't know anything about that. Biden starts talking about fence lines, right? This is somebody who's studied the issue. A fence line is a very specific reference that people who are in that scenario will get. And so that's an important reference both for those families, not that there's thousands and thousands of, not that there's, enough families living in that situation necessarily to swing a state, but there might be if it's a close state. But more importantly, it just shows a familiarity with the issue. It's something that environmental activists as well as racial justice activists will recognize. It just shows you that one is a serious candidate and one is just not.
Yes. I did happen to catch that too. That was also at the end of the debate. And his Trump's response to it was ludicrous. It was clear that he didn't really understand who he was talking about. And if you wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt and think that he was taking a different approach to things, his answer was, and this was again about people who live close to chemical plants and refineries and who bear the brunt of the emissions from these plants and the health the adverse health effects that come along with it. And his response was, people who live near these plants obviously are all employed by these plants, and they're very well paid. They're paid a fortune. And like as though we were renting their lungs to destroy as, filters. Instead of putting the filters on the smokestacks, we're going to put them in your lungs, and we'll compensate you. And of course, anybody with even a passing familiarity with the issue, or even just any knowledge of, real estate, which I thought he was really big into, would know, probably not the wealthiest people in America living along the fence line of a chemical plant or an oil refinery. Probably the lowest cost housing in the whole area, and the lowest income people who can afford home ownership at all, or even rentals, are right there. And they're the ones catching the brunt of all the environmental impacts because they're poor.
You're not familiar with the famous oil refinery on Fifth Avenue?
Right. Whereas, of course, Joe Biden, and anybody who's passed through Delaware probably knows, Joe will be a lot more familiar with oil refineries and chemical plants as a resident of Delaware. But I mean, just even if he wasn't that, just plain getting the issue, the idea. Again, I guess that reveals a lot about the roots of his kind of racism, is that and the racial resentment crowd, that somehow all of these people of color, they say they're victims, but they're stuffing money, chemical and oil money, in their pockets as compensation for living near these places, and yet they complain, and none of that is true. It's not a part of the issue at all. It's kind of astonishing, really. All right, well, we'll take our quick break and come back, and we'll catch up on what you've been writing and what's upcoming after this. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netflix Radio. Let's see. I found a roundup of polling and debate opinions that I can comb through later on, perhaps. Just want to have that handy from the Washington Post. But we're still with Ian Reifowitz in our second segment here. I guess there's a little bit more mopping up, I suppose, we could do from discussion of the debate. I missed the vast middle portion of the debate, maybe a minute or two at the beginning and then the last couple minutes. But there was, obviously there would be some discussion of one of the major lingering issues, COVID-19, and the response to it. And I'm a little curious to find out a little more about what happened, how Trump defends the indefensible, essentially. But you were able to watch all of it. So what happened in that big middle portion of the debate that I didn't get to see?
Well, to answer your question, not well. Look, he really has nothing to say about about what he's done there. He just sort of created some jumbled facts about more tests. Well, we do more testing, and that's why we have more cases, which of course is ridiculous.
I've never gotten that.
Right. Something about I honestly couldn't even follow some of the logic that he used. But
maybe it wasn't.
Right. He wants to pivot from he did a crappy job and it cost lots of lives to we got to open everything up now and Biden will, put us all in the basement, which, everybody just knows that that's not the case. And then Biden had his normal good answers. He said, listen, we're going to follow science. If scientists, tell us we have to close X or Y, then we'll do, we can do that. We can do it in a targeted way. He just sounds much more sane. And then he, showed his typical and I think sincere emotion about the losses that people suffered. And then he did a very good job again of turning Trump's words against him. Even Trump even used these words even some of these themes last night about, it's Democrat cities and states where they're not opening, and Biden said, listen, again, it's the United States of America. I don't see things that way. I'm not going to punish or reward areas based on whether they support me. Although he did a nice job of taking a bit of a dig in the opposite direction. He said, look, the areas that are spiking right now are red states.
True, right.
He said, but then he said, but of course, I'm the president of the United States. So I think it was a smart move to push back at that point, only because, I don't know how tactical it was, but you don't want the voters to get the impression that Democratic governors are the only ones doing it a certain way, or that there's something wrong with the way Democratic governors are doing it. It's just not true. So I thought Biden was very good there, both on the policy end, but then also on the kind of the rhetorical end. It's very clear, the North Carolina undecided voters, they also talked. Each one of them had something to say. Mm-hmm. And, one of the themes that that many of them responded to was that Biden was going to be a more unifying force in the country, certainly compared to Trump. And I think that's one of Biden's strengths. And it's not a platitude. It's one thing if the other guy, if you're running against is, somebody like John McCain or whatever, you might disagree with him on policies, but he doesn't, you can say, I'm going to unify the country. Well, John McCain would for the most part was not going to be a divisive figure. Trump is the uber divisive figure. So it's not just a platitude to say that. It is substantive. And it's effective.
Yeah. Well, I saw others digesting the exchanges, and the idea that he has no clue still of what to do going forward. That was something you mentioned early on in in his COVID-19 response in particular. But yeah, I think that's probably the biggest part of Trump fatigue that leaks even across partisan lines is people just tired of the idea that there's no federal government leadership on a major national and global crisis. And they can't, I don't think anybody can figure out why Trump has opinions on everything in the world and then no ideas of what to do with respect to the COVID response. I did happen to catch, I guess, a clip afterwards of his standard response. He hasn't changed his response. This is 8 months into this pandemic. He's still complaining that one day early on, Anthony Fauci said that people shouldn't go and buy all the N95 masks that might be on the shelves because we might need them for first responders and frontline medical workers. This is astonishing to me that there are still people who are receptive to the message that 6-7 months ago Anthony Fauci made a calculated decision not to send everybody out scrambling to buy up every mask that they could find, and then later said, all right, now that things are settling a little bit, you should be wearing non-medical grade masks. You can even make them at home, but everybody should be looking for ways to get their face covered when they're out in public. And I can't believe it, but I guess it's working, for his base, because they're still out there denying the efficacy of mask wearing and harassing people that they find wearing masks, all linking back to this very fleeting moment in mid-March, which we've had corrected for us and explained as to why it was initially explained this way and then corrected for at least 6 months. It's astonishing to me that he thinks that the rest of the country is still going to buy into this one piece of the Fox News message that not even all of Fox personnel or viewers actually ever bought into. I'm really amazed that people think that maybe they're advising him not to do it and he's doing it anyway. I have no idea, but to waste debate time on that was a little bit surprising to me. I thought they would have trained him out of that.
Right. Well, I mean, and even in the midst of doing that, he says, "Well, Anthony, I don't know. I think he's a Democrat. I don't know."
Oh, right. But
Again,
that's
it's
okay.
a perfect example. Not that he was the greatest candidate in 2016, but he managed to pull the inside straight of all inside straights, but he kept it close enough. Whatever you want to say about him in 2016, there was a piece of his campaign where he was attacking the Democratic and Republican establishments. Now, the way he talks, he is
That's a good
probably
point.
the most hyper-partisan figure in American politics today, and certainly compared to Joe Biden. And Biden says, I'm a proud Democrat, but I'm running for all Americans. Trump says Fauci's a Democrat. I mean, anybody who doesn't like partisanship or hyper-partisanship watching that is so turned off by Fauci, I think he's a Democrat. I mean, it would, and I'm a partisan and whatever.
Yeah.
I have to think that is just something very stupid, frankly, in terms of how you would present yourself in a debate, especially compared to Biden, who's doing such a good job of the opposite. Well, so it's beyond even the racial divisiveness, is the partisan divisiveness. And to me, it just all came together. Fauci, I think he's a Democrat. I don't know.
Yeah. And then I always love his fallback. That's okay. That's okay. Every time he says that's okay, he's really, really deeply offended. Right. That's his escape route. Well, at any rate,
healthcare. Well, let's not skip healthcare.
Okay,
very quickly.
Let's not.
He was asked
again,
what would you do if Obamacare was repealed? And he says, "Well, we've done so much already.
There's hardly anything left to do."
Right, and we decided to keep running Obamacare as best we can, like that was a choice, given that you, as president, have to follow the law. And then he basically said if it was repealed, the Democrats would have to do something and they'd have to come along. So it's almost like he was saying, if it's repealed, the Democrats will come up with a plan.
All right, they might.
I mean, I just, anybody watching that, it's almost strange. Like, why not have a plan? I mean, why not say something, Republican? Oh, well, we'll block grant to the states, blah, blah. But and Biden was right there. He said, listen, you can't do pre-existing conditions. And granted, he could have gone a bit deeper into the weeds. Maybe it wasn't necessary. He could have said, listen, the whole reason you have a rule saying that insurance companies can't ban people with pre-existing conditions is because they will if you don't have that rule. Well, if you get rid of Obamacare, you can't make that rule again without Obamacare, because it's a bargain, right? You tell the insurance companies, on the one hand, you got to take everybody with pre-existing conditions, but on the other hand, the government is going to give significant subsidies so that insurance companies will get 20 million more customers. And from those 20 million more customers, they'll be able to make enough money to handle the cost of people with pre-existing conditions. He could do that in a minute or two. And it's fairly logical. Biden chose not to go there, and that's fine. But there's no way to have the pre-existing conditions protections without the subsidies for premiums that go into Obamacare. And then, again, you wouldn't have the subsidies for policies. The federal government is not going to give subsidies for junk policies. So you have to have certain minimums and certain standards in those policies. Otherwise, the federal government is going to be subsidizing people who are then sold junk policies by insurance companies. All of these things fit together. It's a system. Yeah. So there's no way that Trump is going to be able to protect pre-existing conditions. I don't think he could even talk in a way that would explain any kind of plan a quarter of coherently as I did. Not that I'm the world's healthcare expert. And maybe they just tell him, we know you can't explain it, so don't do it.
Maybe, but you're only going to be given 2 minutes to do it anyway. So I think we ordinarily we can train a SEAL to do this for 2 minutes, but not you, sir. So I guess we'll work on something else. Yeah, and that message will only be reinforced when Sunday rolls around and 60 Minutes airs whatever version of the interview with Leslie Stahl that they are able to piece together from the garbage that they shot. Trump having released his own version of the video. I guess they just had somebody there taking video of the interview while it was going on. And I don't know whether that's standard practice or they had this idea in mind that they were going to release this stuff early. regardless, I guess Trump feels like he has punished 60 Minutes by, I don't know, possibly eating into their hopeful, or what they had hoped for high ratings with now being spoiled or something like that. But yesterday he spent the day releasing pieces of his own videotape of the exchanges, and there's no universe in which raw tape ever helps Donald Trump. I don't really know why they went ahead and did that. Maybe, and ordinarily I would say, well, they couldn't edit it because then they would be accused of editing this material. We would all have seen it, but what does that matter to them? They would simply say, no, we didn't edit it, and lie about that. But I guess they were just too lazy to do that. And sure enough, the raw tape is, for most normal people, more damning of Donald Trump by far than anything on the part of Leslie Stahl or journalists in general. But
right, CBS would have put it together in a way that at least stylistically didn't make him look like an ass.
Yeah, they have to fit it within a certain amount of time, so a lot of the hemming and hawing and double speak and repetition will be edited out. Something I'd like to be able to do for our own show here. But raw tape always of Donald Trump, whenever there are White House or Oval Office interviews, that's always for me and for a lot of people, the highlight is when before the New York Times, or maybe just after the New York Times releases the cleaned up version of it. We asked the president about health care and he gave this answer, and the answer wasn't exactly coherent, but we took out all the garbage and attacks on Democrats or whatever, and published this substance. When you get the raw tape, you really begin to see how much difficulty he has stringing sentences together and making sense or finishing sentences after he's begun them. So we'll all be reminded of that, though, the fact that he has no plan on Sunday, when they released the footage of him saying, we're going to, same thing as always said, since 2016, we're going to do something beautiful. I'm not sure what it is, but it's going to be beautiful and everyone's going to love it. Apparently, Leslie Stahl was handed some large bound volume, which was supposed to be a compilation of all the work that they had done in the healthcare area in their 4 years in office, which I'm not certain what exactly that was supposed to have to do with the question of what is your plan for replacing Obamacare. But have we definitively found that this book was full of blank pages? I know everyone suspected that, and it looked like it from the photos, but have you seen any information from CBS that we opened the book to some other pages and there was print in there, or no? Yeah,
there's a photo of one page that looks blank. I mean, I would have to think, frankly, if the whole book was blank, CBS would have released a major story saying, hey, the book was blank. So I think we can assume it probably wasn't blank. They're not, as stupid as the Trump White House is, they're not that stupid. There might be a
feels like a
page. Between each chapter, maybe.
Yeah.
I guess they could have done, they could have had like one letter on each page to spell out Obamacare sucks.
There's still a couple hundred pages to go.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not certain, and I haven't heard what's in that book, but I guess it certainly wasn't anything convincing enough for CBS to say, he laid it out for us coherently. It doesn't answer our question, but it's a good answer to what have you done since then. But I haven't even seen them say that, so I'm actually kind of curious about what's in there.
Leslie Stahl, in one word, really summed up everything. I did see a snippet of it. She says, what are you guys going to do? And he says, we'll have a great plan. She interrupts. She said, will?
Yeah.
Like, will?
Right.
Obviously after, 46 months as president, will have a great plan. Will? Future tense? Come on.
We will soon. Yeah, I mean, this is, week 48 of the 2-week waiting period, whatever, for this time around. Not to mention, of course, as President Obama himself in campaigning in the last couple of days reminds everybody, it's 10 years they've been saying repeal and replace, and we still haven't seen the replace plan. We saw Obama saying it. We saw a Senate candidate in Michigan, I think, right? The one running against Gary Peters, trip himself up in an interview with that, and insist that we're going to repeal and replace, and they ask him point blank, what are you going to replace it with? And he still didn't know. So,
oh yeah, poor John James.
Yes, and this is his second run for Senate, I think, too. And
it is. He ran against Stabenow 2 years ago.
Yeah, so still nobody mailed him a plan. I was waiting for it to show up in my mailbox, and I was going to read it, but it hasn't shown up. So recurring problem for them. Meanwhile, I guess closer to the immediate issue of the election that's coming up in 10 days now. We'll turn back to the electoral politics of it. You've been writing and are working now on a new piece forthcoming on the outreach, both that the Trump campaign has pretended it's doing or claimed success in doing, for instance, in reaching out to Jewish American voters. This is now the 90th election in a row that Republicans have totally turned the page with Jewish American voters, and they're totally coming on board with the Republican program, in which they are not coming on board with the Republican program, and in overwhelming numbers, as usual. But also you're writing about, in an upcoming piece, work that there still remains to do in outreach. I guess, are we talking about undecided voters still, but people who have, there's an actual population, as hard as it can be sometimes to believe, of people who've vacillated between having voted for Obama, then switched, like, what the hell, we'll try something new, vote for Trump. And then interesting subcategories I know that you were talking about people who then swung back for the midterm elections to voting for Democrats in their House and Senate races. Others who stuck with Republicans, and they clearly are on a different path. But to me, it was just confusing just to think about the various permutations and different categories of voters that existed out there. But messaging to each of them, I guess it actually in the end was less confusing because there were so many common elements that could be used. But where do you want to start with this? The old trope of the Jewish American voters finally changing, or prospectively looking ahead to what might you say to a swing voter should you run into one of these rare creatures in the next week?
Right. All right. Well, let's start with the first one.
Right.
We can talk about it relatively quickly, which is that, new polling coming out is showing that Jewish voters are just as strong as ever for Democrats, and for Biden, maybe even a bit more, which is not surprising. I think Biden's going to run ahead of Hillary in general. The biggest poll in terms of the sample size came from the American Jewish Committee. 75% said they were voting for Biden and 20% for Trump. That's a little bit stronger than the numbers for Hillary, which was around 71. And then there's, in terms of exit polling, it was 71. But granted, they were third-party candidates. Look, traditionally, Jews vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. Other than Black Americans, they're the most loyal of the major, if you want to call them major, ethnic, religious, cultural groups in terms of consistent voting for Democrats. And this goes back decades. Trump has, tried in his own way, I guess, or in his own mind, thinks he's, he's trying to get Jewish votes with things that he's done in Israel.
Yes.
Which really only play to the most right-wing, evangelical voters. And then also what we have seen is that, Orthodox Jews have over the last few years really shifted to be solid Republicans and really Trumpers. They represent about 10% of the American Jewish population, and they're the flip in terms of, overall, they probably go about 3-1 for Trump, maybe a little more than 3-1. But still, so if you take them out, if you want to think of it from a sociological perspective, and you want to see Orthodox Jews as one sociological group, and all other non-Orthodox Jews ranging from middle to the most secular to still observant but not Orthodox, they are about, you could do the math, but if you take the Orthodox out, they're probably about 80 or 82 to 13 or 14 for Biden over Trump, which is an even bigger number than historically, because the Orthodox probably have not, are at a high point in terms of the percentage of the population. They probably have, were 5% of the Jewish population a generation ago. Anyway, it's not working. It doesn't matter that Trump has Ivanka and Jared in his White House. It doesn't matter that he's moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. American Jews outside of the Orthodox community are not biting, and they're going to come in for Joe Biden in historic numbers.
Yeah,
that's
no surprise.
That's a straightforward. And again, why wouldn't they? This is a president who, as I mentioned in the Post, said that there were very fine people, or some very fine people. That's a quote. Some very fine people on both sides of a protest where one side were a bunch of neo-Nazis chanting, "Jews will not replace us." That is not. Saying that there were very fine people among a group of people doing that is not something that's going to endear you to Jewish Americans, or frankly to anybody with a sense of morality. And that's where Trump is, and nothing can change that. Nothing can unsay what Trump said in Charlottesville, and that's why Jewish American voters are going to deliver for Joe Biden.
Still surprising that it doesn't register with Orthodox voters, but I don't know. They have overriding issues on their minds, I suppose. But by far the bulk of Jewish American voters just completely in another place. No fault of Trump's that he didn't convert him, I guess. It just wasn't really in the offing. But surprising that anybody would have thought he would have made more headway. Maybe the fact that maybe it's demographic growth among the ultra-Orthodox that has convinced him that he's making the turn, because I'm not certain he pays a great deal of attention to the differences within the Jewish community. I'm sure Jared would bring him statistics and say, there's by raw numbers, there are more Jewish voters supporting you than has been the case traditionally for Republicans, or that anybody would believe, given the fact that you made this ridiculous racist comment about Charlottesville. So good news, we must be doing something right. And the answer is, there's just more ultra-Orthodox than there used to be.
But to clarify, he's not even getting more.
Oh, he's not? I thought you would mention
No, I mean, if he's turned the ultra-Orthodox from 60% Republican to 80% Republican, but he's turned the non-Orthodox from 5% Democratic to 85% Democratic. There's a lot more non-Orthodox. So
that's true, certainly. Yeah. I think in terms of raw numbers, the size of the ultra-Orthodox community is increasing.
Sure,
but so I guess they're producing some more votes. But you're right. Generally speaking, still a very small part of the overall Jewish community. But he hears from Jared, who will want to give him the rosiest picture. And I wouldn't even include Jared in that. I mean, Jared considers himself modern Orthodox. Right. But not much in the way of overlap in terms of actual practice anyway. And I would say mindset even between modern Orthodox and Hasidic, Haredi Jewish Americans. But
politically, though, this is what I go into a little bit more in the article. The modern Orthodox politically are also Trump Republicans. Not as, maybe not as much as the ultra-Orthodox, but the poll, the AJC poll, didn't break out modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, for whatever that means. Haredi, Hasidim, now we're getting a little into the weeds, but it just did Orthodox, and that was like 74-18 Trump. So there's not much room for the modern Orthodox to be, even 50-50 if the whole group is 74-18. Unless the modern Orthodox are just tiny, and I don't think they're that tiny. There's some there. I mean, I'll send you a link you can put in the show notes. There's a really interesting discussion of what the author calls the evangelization of the Orthodox. That they have really become. They've just sort of decided to mirror the evangelical Christians in terms of their republicanism and their pro-Trump stuff. I'll send you a link for the show notes.
I think people would find that interesting if they're otherwise confused about it. And I'll dive a little further into it. That'd be great. Thank you.
Sure.
But I guess as long as we're parsing things closely, again, that's the major takeaway I took from the preview of your next upcoming piece. That was the biggest. The biggest non-frontline major takeaway for me. I was reading through it and saying, look at the way we're parsing the electorate here. There's so many there are so many people in the world, Ian, and eventually you find differences as well as commonalities among all of them. But I'm talking about the way, how should we even describe this? The outreach that the Democrats ought to be doing to people who I guess are still open to the possibility of swinging back to Democratic voters, but I guess either flirted with Trump as an alternative, never really flirting with Trumpism, but just sort of a change in directions, and maybe we'll have something new and fresh with this outsider, I guess, might be what motivated them, and how to bring them back into the fold and convince them that voting with Democrats is where they ought to be. It seems like a significant challenge, but actually I thought the formula as you were describing it sounded like, well, maybe it's not that big of a challenge. We're already making these arguments with lots of people.
Right. Well, that's the thing is, and this is something I've talked with you about before, and I've written about over a long period of time. It's not useful in terms of voters, in terms of reaching out to voters. It's not useful to think of voters as racist or not racist. There are people who hold some racially resentful views, and they also hold progressive views on issues like the economy or healthcare or the environment. And so the goal is not necessarily, you're not going to turn them from racist into not racist, but you're going to activate on election day those other interests, their interests on healthcare, the environment, or economics, so that they vote based on those interests, and the other racial resentments are sort of, the volume is turned down on election day and they can ignore them.
Okay, well, let's return to that after a brief break. We deserve more time on that. We'll be right back. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And I just a brief 1-minute break to catch up with the article that Ian wanted to send me. And but we got around late to the preview of this other article, which I guess is just as well. We won't have too many spoilers of what's upcoming. But take us back into this analysis here of, and I noticed also that you brought up the what is the name of the series of videos? This is from the historian that you've mentioned so often. Yeah. Okay.
There's so much there. I mean, I'll try to to give you a sense overall. Not too surprising, right? And that these Obama-Trump voters, so to speak, especially the ones who are still likely to come back, are the ones who expressed, some strong progressive views on economic issues. And it's not that surprising that these people exist. If you think about, whatever you want to call them, white working class Democrats who maybe are not particularly, progressive on racial issues. They don't respond, super well to some of the more woke arguments, but they are struggling economically, and they believe in things like unions and raising the minimum wage. People have contradictory thoughts in their head, and they don't see them as contradictory, and that's fine. We need votes where we can get them, yes, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't sacrifice progressive values, and so that's something that we have to do, and it's something we can do. Biden does this, I think, pretty well. A couple of weeks ago, he gave a speech in Wisconsin where he specifically addressed these Obama-Trump voters. And he said, and what does he emphasize to them? He emphasizes, first of all, he shows them empathy, talks about how they might, not have felt heard or seen. This is evocative of something that President Obama did repeatedly. Obama did it especially well in his Philadelphia race speech of 2008, where he talked specifically about understanding that poor whites, struggling whites, don't necessarily feel privileged. He also rightly emphasized that right-wing radio and hosts and politicians, people whom I've written about, will use their racial resentments and play on them in order to bring them over to Republican, to voting Republican, even though they're ignoring, or trying to get them to distract from the reality of what Republicans are about. And Biden did a good job with this as well. He emphasized, Trump cutting taxes for the wealthy, whereas Democrats want to raise the federal minimum wage. It wasn't a whole economic policy plan, but he made the contrast on in terms of who's going to be on your side as an average person. And then the other piece I think that's important is that, and I mentioned this in terms of what Obama did, and Obama was really terrific about this, is this race-class strategy, which is comes out of some studies done by Professor Ian Haney-Lopez out of Berkeley.
Yes,
they test all these different messages.
Okay.
We talked about them before. The most effective message is one in which, and I really just can give you the guts of what Lopez has said. He talks about this race class solidarity, and the guts of the message is this. He says, this is how you present it to people. Certain politicians exploit racist rhetoric to divide and distract while they rig government and the economy for themselves and their big money donors. They get richer, we get poorer, and the power of government is turned against communities of color. But we can fight back and win. Here's the most powerful movement building message today. When we come together to reject racism as a weapon of the rich, we can make sure that government works for all of us of every race and color. So that's a message that I think when you lead with that message and you bring in the economic differences, you bring in the differences on healthcare, you can reach those Obama-Trump voters who are overwhelmingly white, but you also reach voters of color, Americans of color, Latino, Black voters in particular. They responded especially well to this message as well. And Lopez has another piece where he talks about how to reach the Latino vote. Unsurprisingly, he says we need to use this message here as well. And it's not enough to reach the Latino vote. He says it's not enough to simply decry racism. He said, first of all, many Latinos don't see themselves as even a separate racial group. He says many Latinos view themselves as whites. They see themselves as immigrants, and, very, similar to other immigrant groups, Italians in the past or whomever, who are integrating into a larger community. They don't see their ethnicity or race as defining features, whereas the more progressive ones do, obviously, to a much larger degree. And he says this message that he talks about, this race class message, gets the most positive response across ethnic lines compared to some of these other messages, including, and what he says we can't do is just talk about economics, right? It's not enough to just talk about economics, because then you're ignoring race. It's the elephant in the room, and the voters of color think, why aren't you talking about racism at all? But in fact, even the race class message, which is what I just gave you, does the best among whites as well as among the voters of color. And so why wouldn't you do that? So in order to reach out to these Obama-Trump voters, you have to go with the issues. In terms of issues, you go with where you have strong appeal, but it's the issues where you have strong appeal are also good, strong, progressive issues, like raising the minimum wage, like greater tax fairness, making the wealthiest pay their fair share, like a progressive health care plan. Those Obama-Trump voters, for example, loved the ones who came back to the Democrats in 2018, at least, loved Medicare for all, right? I mean, you're not going to necessarily target or think about Obama-Trump voters who stuck with the Republicans in 2018. Although even them, they had majority. This was pretty amazing. Obama to Trump to Republican 2018 voters, over 50% of them supported Medicare for all, which is to the left of where Biden is. So the point is, people are complicated, right? If you want to win Pennsylvania, you want to win Michigan, you want to win Wisconsin, you have to talk to those voters. And there are gettable voters, and you can do it, and you must do it in a way that doesn't sacrifice progressive values on equality of any kind, of racial justice of any kind. You don't go out there and sort of wink and nod and play racial games with them. No. But what you do is you can address their racial resentment head on by saying, listen, the other side is stoking your racial resentment. The other side is trying to scare you about black and brown people, but they're lying. They're lying because they don't have anything to sell you that's positive about what they're going to do for you, because they're not going to do anything for you. They're for Wall Street. We're for Scranton. We're for Main Street, whatever. So you create that kind of unified message. I think Biden has done a good job with that. I think Barack Obama did a very good job with that. It's one of the reasons why he was able to win the election in 2008 and in 2012. Hillary Clinton perhaps did a less good job. Although, again, we've talked about this. If it wasn't for Comey, she would have been probably just fine. So this is the message that we need to get out there. And I think overall Biden is doing a good job of it. And I tried to lay out some things and reach out to anybody who might be reading Daily Kos, who might still be an undecided voter. whether that's an Obama-Trump voter or a Latino voter. I hope I'm reaching people.
Well, I hope so. Even if a vast portion of the undecided universe doesn't necessarily reside at Daily Kos, this is something that we all probably ought to spend some time on. I noticed you mentioned it's a series of videos that he's put together, the Race Class Academy, and the links are in here, and I can provide them in the roundup again too. But you mentioned in here that it took about 25 minutes or so to get through all 12 of these videos. It's not a major investment in time, and although you might think, well, with 10 days left in the election, perhaps this is a little late in coming. But as one of the commenters who's listening in now mentions, all of this, obviously, these ideas as strategy for the election have to be, of course, delivered on in governing in the future, or else the messaging perhaps becomes worthless or less valuable in future cycles. So I guess I bring that up. Not only it's good observation. Obviously, we do have to deliver on what's discussed and promised in campaign times, but it's not like we're out of time entirely here. We may be down to the wire, but of course, if the message is absorbed by enough people, you only have a few days to reach out to undecided voters, but a lot of us might be spending our weekends or even the entirety of next week doing that sort of outreach or participating in that sort of outreach, whether phone banking or literature drops or what have you. But in addition, this is a lesson we'll have to absorb for making the case as advocates during a Biden administration for governance, and saying that we need to keep an eye on that ball, these things that we discussed. And it's not a major, we're not going out of our way in order to do that either, because these are very much progressive policy values. But we need to kind of absorb the language with which we can discuss it, not only now, prospectively in election season, but afterwards to push for it and to hold our own elected officials to the promise, to the extent that they have made it, to execute on this. So
right, they've got to deliver
very
on
much worth it.
But they will on healthcare. They're going to deliver on healthcare. I think they're going to deliver on a federal minimum wage hike. They're going to deliver on making taxes more progressive. These are things that they are going to deliver on. But this is an important message. It has to really be a permanent message, because unless something radical changes, there are going to continue to be right-wing racial demagogues. Even if it's not Donald Trump, it's going to be other people. I'd love to get to a point where Republican politicians don't do it, and maybe it's just media figures. But the point of this is to inoculate voters against the constant barrage of racial demagoguery, of race baiting, and to get these voters to be able to diagnose it and say, when Limbaugh or whoever tomorrow's Limbaugh is says, "Oh, black and brown people, blah 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 blah," this, that, and the other, they're coming. Right now it's Trump. Well, they're going to bring crime to your suburbs. I mean, these are what Professor Lopez calls dog whistles. As long as Republicans are using dog whistles, we need to get voters to be inoculated against the dog whistle. And the inoculation is, okay, they're dog whistling because they don't want you to remember that they are for the rich and not you. Yeah. Simple. They are dog whistling so that middle and working class whites are more angry or afraid of black and Hispanic people than they are thinking about their own family's bottom line, which is never going to be helped by Republicans. That's the inoculation. So the policy piece is one thing, but as long as Republicans or conservatives are race baiting, we need to keep this message going as the counter to it.
All right. So no expiration date on this. Doesn't end with the election.
I hope there is someday.
No. Well, yeah, okay. At some point in the future, yes. But if you're thinking, well, no point in implementing this now with only 10 days to go, the answer is, well, right now we're going to go, you're going to have to move pretty seamlessly into thinking about midterm elections in 2022, whatever the outcome here. But certainly, especially if we succeed in electing Joe Biden, of course, the major Republican project becomes undermining his effectiveness and that probably starts with their best attempt from their part to recapture one or both houses of Congress in the upcoming elections, and their tried and true method for doing so will be dragging out these dog whistles. They've worked for them, and this sort of inflammation of racial division is their best hope of being able to undermine Biden administration. I'm sure that, assuming Mitch McConnell is still around, although, he's not looking all that healthy at the moment these days, but assuming he's still around and has influence inside the Senate Republican conference, he will, I'm sure, give the same speech to his troops that he gave the day Obama was elected. We have to turn all our energies to making him a one-term president, and that's likely how they'll do it.
Well, let's hope that the result is that we get a two-term Biden presidency.
Right. If it comes out the same way, I'll take it, I guess. All right. Well, thanks very much, Ian. I know you've extended your segment to stay around and explain this, but I think an important point, certainly, we're going to have to make this a practice, not only in the next 10 days, but for over the next 2 years or more, I guess, until this is, wiped out as a Republican campaign strategy. And perhaps, cleaning house in 2020 and maybe again, if necessary, in 2022 is the best hope of convincing even Republicans that this is simply not a strategy that works for them long term. And if they can be made to believe that, then we may have succeeded.
Right. Nothing succeeds like beating the hell out of people at the election, at the ballot box.
Yes. That's true. All right. Well, thanks very much again for extending your usual segment for our sake here. And all right, we've got an exciting week coming up. All I can say is good luck to everybody in making it through the madness. Thanks again, Ian.
Always a pleasure, David. We'll
Okay.
see you next week.
Yes, well, we'll catch up. We'll see what's going on next week. I've informed everybody, of course, what's happening. It may be a little bit iffy on Friday for me. Thursday we'll be off, but we can we can talk about possibly making up for that either in the following week or whatever. But it occurs to me that now that we've made it all the way through election season, coming to election day. This was initially what we discussed, but I'll be hoping that maybe we can extend our discussions a little bit beyond and into the transition, and of course into the initial days of the Biden administration, if your schedule permits. I thank you for hanging with us all this time and helping us stay sane through this campaign season.
It's my pleasure. We'll see how the teaching goes.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's the first priority, of course. All right. Well, very good. We'll talk about it a little bit more. Thanks, everybody, and move on to the rest of the stories of the day. Ian, take care. We'll speak again soon.
You got it.
Okay. Let's see what's on the schedule for there's no schedule, obviously, for the rest of the day, but other stories that deserve some attention before heading into the weekend. Let's see. I'm thinking here that this story, summarized by the New York Times most recently, but brought up in the last couple of days. I have seen others writing on it, but in particular Walter Schaub commenting on it. We'll get right into the maybe the New York Times summation of things from Eric Lipton here. I have a feeling that this becomes a story, if not over the weekend, then perhaps during transition, regardless, I guess, really, of what happens with the outcome of the election. But especially well, you know what? It's worrisome either way, which is a good predictor of its value as a story here. Trump issues order giving him more leeway. To do anything is bad news. More leeway to hire and fire federal workers, which is the kind of thing that I think among his base, and even possibly well outside of his base, the general disfavor with which, let's say, the less politically engaged, and even some who are politically engaged, view government workers, lifetime, if not lifetime, but, civil service, career civil servants who aren't placed inside the federal government as political appointees and who serve from one administration to the next in generally nonpartisan roles. This has been an increasing issue or increasing problem under several Republican administrations, and just one of the many areas in which I expected that the Trump administration, as the successor Republican administration to the Bush administration, would make things worse. Subheader here explains a bit more. The move would give the president greater freedom to weed out what he sees as a, quote, deep state bureaucracy. The executive order, which could be rescinded if he is not reelected, so that's good news, was condemned by civil service unions. And of course you would expect that, but I also expected the backlash against the condemnation from civil service unions, and I did see that pretty quickly in these discussion threads on Twitter, people saying, well, civil service unions are the worst thing that's happened to the federal government in XYZ years, and all the complaints about corrupt unionism that are familiar arguments from Republican administrations in the past, not just public service employee unions, but unionism in general that applies to in their view. Here's the story. President Trump signed an executive order this week that could substantially expand his ability to hire and fire tens of thousands of federal workers during a second term, or even, I would fear, in the transition from a first term to out the effing door at last, potentially allowing him to weed out what he sees as a deep state bureaucracy working to undermine him. Largely fantasy, of course, but he just views the career civil service who is interested in doing an efficient job of whatever, executing whatever policy they're handed, so that the American public is served. And of course, Trump is handing them orders not to serve the American public, but to damage and attack large sectors of the American public, and they would tend to want to drag their feet on that, not because they're part of a deep state that opposes any elected leadership, but because his leadership style runs counter to the idea that there ought to be an efficient civil service that helps people in general. Anyway, the executive order issued late Wednesday and described by one prominent federal union leader as the most profound undermining of the civil service in our lifetimes would allow federal agencies to go through their employee rosters and reclassify certain workers in a way that would strip them of job protections that now cover most federal employees. In other words, basically, when Trump, say, purports to order some illegal action, I've signed the order, but what I'm asking for is illegal or unconstitutional, but I just don't believe that should be the case, or that my judges will rule that it's the case. And civil servants say, well, I'm being asked to carry out something that seems pretty obviously problematic. We're going to do this, if we do it at all, very slowly. He can now do his best to identify them and fire them where they used to have legal protection from that. Let's see. The White House, in a statement that accompanied the executive order, said the new employee classification was justified because under current rules, removing poor performers, even from these critical positions, is time-consuming and difficult, by design, to shield them from political retaliation. As a practical matter, the new order is unlikely to have a widespread effect unless Mr. Trump is reelected, giving him a second term to carry out the new approach across the government. Should he be defeated by his Democratic opponent, former Vice President Joe Biden, the new president could simply rescind it. Currently, only about 4,000 of the more than 2 million federal employees are so-called political appointees, who are typically replaced with each presidential administration. They include senior agency officials who oversee the development of federal policies. The bulk of federal workers are considered career civil servants who have certain protections, both in the way they're hired, typically based on a point system that is supposed to make the hiring competitive, and a time-consuming appeals-based process that must be used if an agency manager wants to dismiss someone. Federal auditors have long complained that the process of removing substandard federal workers is too complicated and slow. The Government Accountability Office concluded in one 2015 report, for example, that legal issues can also reduce a supervisor's willingness to address poor performance. So there is an underlying issue here. It's just being exploited by Trump. Trump's new executive order would create a new class of federal worker known as Schedule F employees. That would be made up of career staff members who are involved in confidential policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating work. This would most likely include the thousands of federal employees who write the regulations that translate federal laws into formal rules, as well as economists, scientists, lawyers, and managers, according to labor lawyers who've examined this new order. The new classification would not apply to federal workers who are part of the Senior Executive Service that helps oversee federal agencies, according to the White House. Trump administration officials had been discussing for months how to purge, quote, bad people who are part of the, quote, deep state, Axios reported in February. The effort accelerated early this year after Mr. Trump hired a new head of the White House Office of Presidential Personnel, John McEntee, who served as a campaign aide to Mr. Trump in 2016. Federal agencies would have 7 months to conduct a review of their workforce to decide which existing employees could be reclassified into this new status under the executive order. Okay. So the fact that I guess they stretched things out over 7 months provides some protection against its being implemented if Trump were to lose the election, provided he then leaves office, I guess. Because this would take place on an agency-by-agency basis, it's hard to predict how many employees could end up being reclassified, and any future president could revoke the order. The employee protections date back to a law adopted 137 years ago called the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which was enacted after the assassination of President James Garfield, who was shot by a disappointed federal job seeker. It might be an impetus for some legislation, yes. The goal was to remove politics from the federal government's daily operations by having career employees carry out the policies set by political appointees. Labor leaders and other prominent experts in federal employee standards condemned Trump's order. This is a declaration of war on the career civil service, said Richard Loeb, a senior policy counsel at the American Federation of Government Employees, the largest union representing federal workers, who also served in the White House Office of Management and Budget for 2 decades during Republican and Democratic administrations. It is an attempt to politicize the process and to hire cronies and fire enemies. It's really a 19th century concept. Mr. Loeb said the union was examining if the executive order could be legally challenged. The proposal has already provoked criticism by some Democrats in Congress, including Representative Jerry Connolly, Democrat of Virginia, who serves as chairman of the House panel that oversees government operations. This executive order is yet another attack on federal employees that addresses absolutely none of the issues that can hinder effective federal recruitment and hiring, Connolly said in a statement. It's a cheap ploy to let the Trump administration replace talent and acumen with fealty and self-dealing. But other Republicans have endorsed the move. Our founding fathers, never envisioned a massive, unelected, unaccountable federal government with the power to create policies that impact Americans' everyday lives. Representative James R. Comer, Republican of Kentucky, about whom I know nothing, said in a statement. That's the end of the article, which is just fine because, of course, we're coming up to our third break. But there's been plenty of reaction to this on Twitter, including reaction from Walter Schaub, who, of course, you recall is formerly of the Government Ethics Office and would know something about this. He's commenting on it. We'll perhaps bring you the bulk of his tweet thread after our 2-minute break and discuss some of the possibilities Trump would have for screwing with everything, even if he loses. Wow. Coming right back. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to Patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. Got one more segment to devote to this. Walter Schaub, as I mentioned to you, former director of the Office of Government Ethics, had a bit to say about this. Both yesterday and the day before. I guess we could start with the day before discussions. Let's see. He is is commenting on the tweet of Shane Harris from the Washington Post and the Post's coverage of this, which he expresses this way. Shane Harris says, "This is a very big deal. Trump issues order for some career federal employees to lose their civil service protections." And linking to, is it his own article? Let's see. No, Lisa Rain and Eric Yoder writing the piece for the Washington Post. We'll include it for your perusal in the roundup. But Shane saying, yeah, very big deal. Further reading here in Government Executive magazine. So perhaps we can include that as well if you really want to get into the detail of things. Walter Schaub, though, commenting, this is an attack on the rule of law. The laws protecting career federal officials don't exist primarily for the benefit of the officials. And this is another example of these things, just sort of interesting in terms of the stuff we've discussed before, that these rules which Republicans like Donald Trump very often view as red tape and nonsense and having been created for the benefit of, like in this case, benefit of the workers, not seeing or understanding or even knowing about the original motivation in which that it was protection for the government in general and for the American people. What other subject is it that we were talking? Oh, yes, right. Like disclosure requirements for the visitors' logs and the president's schedule, etc., and the phone call logs, right? He views that as, one, bureaucratic red tape, and two, as about trying to give journalists material with which they can nail him for his corruption. I mean, that's what's at bottom. Of course, he doesn't admit that it's corruption, but he might as well. Every time he accuses everybody else of it being, of their activity being corruption, it's an admission of his own corruption. But again, the phone logs he views, why would I keep a phone log when it's just material for reporters to use to try to pin corruption on me? So I'm not going to do it. Whereas, it should be viewed as, no, this way, if you keep these logs, visitor logs, phone call logs accurately, then when people say things like, I spoke to the president about this and got his permission to do this, or he said this horrible thing in a conversation with me, and the president wants to deny ever having had that conversation with somebody, you're able to look at accurately kept, honestly kept phone and visitation logs, and you can prove, no, that discussion did not take place based on how thoroughly and honestly we keep these logs. Similar sort of situation here, I think. As he points out, it's an attack on the protection that's not there for the benefit of the career federal officials. They exist to protect the American people against career civil servants having to carry out illegal orders from political appointees. You see, that being the difference here, as opposed to saying, well, I have to go along with this because otherwise I'll be fired. They have the ability to stand up and say, if this is clearly or even arguably an illegal or unconstitutional order, there's a process by which we can resist this before the damage is done. So, an important part of the protection that they've got is a protection for you. So he then commented a day later, if Trump wins the election, this little noticed executive order that he issued yesterday may be the most dangerous thing he's done yet. It's an interesting, compared to the other things he's done, that's a pretty amazing statement, right? It's a bureaucratic sounding topic, but it moves the full might of the federal government into the unchecked hands of corrupt political masters. That's very true. And even if Trump loses, he goes on to comment, and this is a slightly different approach about what happens if he loses than I was taking, but this is also a good point. And a point we've made about other administrations in the past. Even if Trump loses, he has paved the way for the next Republican president to do the same. But at the beginning of an administration, Congress will need to shore up civil service protections if it doesn't want to leave the survival of the rule of law in the hands of a president, whoever that president may be. And since my concern has always been that Republican administrations, even if a Democratic administration intervenes, seem to be very interested in picking up where the previous Republican administration left off. It might be too late for Trump in adhering to the plan outlined in this so-called, executive order. It might be too late if he adheres to the rules that he's set out in the executive order for him to implement any of this. But then again, he might set all of those rules aside, either with another executive order or just plain ignoring what he said in the executive order and saying, let him sue. I don't know that he doesn't try to clean house during a transition, even if he accepts his defeat in the election. And he might invoke the order and change the rules, or he might just ignore the order. He may have no idea that he signed this stupid order, but fully believe that it's within the power of the president, even though he's just been defeated in the election. He remains in office through January 20th. He might just start trying to fire people left and right, and would likely lose in court. But again, my concern is that he doesn't really particularly care. The fact that he might end up losing in court. And again, vindicating your rights in court is great and all, but it doesn't necessarily solve the practical problems of, let's say, for instance, on November 4th, recognizing early on that he's lost the election, he begins firing people all over the federal government, and they say, no, I still have protections. Yes, he's signed this executive order, but this power to change the designation of certain civil servants doesn't even kick in until after a 7-month study period with recommendations made formally, et cetera, et cetera. So no, the authority to root me out individually from the civil service and fire me just doesn't exist. But in the meantime, the various police forces employed by some of these departments start locking people out, or just plain security, start locking people out and deactivating their email and work computers and identity cards and access keys, and say, the president has ordered you out. You have the right, I guess, to sue to try to get your job back or prove that your firing was somehow illegal. And you might eventually prevail, but not likely in the next couple of weeks or even in the next couple of months. And for as long as Trump remains president, you will not be employed here or paid by your former employer, the federal government. And though you might be able to get back pay in suing, good luck surviving until you get that judgment against the federal government, because we'll appeal it. As long as Trump is president, that thing is going to be stuck in appeals for the rest of his administration. And it isn't until late January that a new incoming administration with lots on its plate, by the way, is going to be able to even get around to starting to fix any of this sort of thing. And even if they decide that they're going to drop the case, it'll take them some time to do. And in the meantime, if you're hanging on for getting your back pay, good luck to you. I don't know whether you can make it work, and how many of those people will believe that they'll be able to vindicate their rights and get their back pay, but in the meantime find new work, which work they won't leave necessarily to go back into civil service and pick up where they left off. They want their back pay, yes, but in the meantime, we've found a new job and I'll just be staying in that one. Well, that's not a terrible outcome necessarily for the incoming Biden administration, and they can hire new people. And maybe that's a good thing, but it may also, that process, depending on who gets fired and how many of them, or whether it's a wholesale firing or alleged firing anyway, of all these civil servants, it might leave tremendous gaps in the federal departments that are supposed to have been able to hit the ground running in an incoming Biden administration. It can create an awful lot of problems. So I would keep an eye on that one. Seems like an important one to watch. And, there's very little reason to believe, well, I don't know. I guess it depends on whether you believe that the people who frame these executive orders for Trump believe that they're going to win this election. There are lots of Trump supporters inside the federal government, among the ranks of his political appointees and top advisors, who might very well be fooling themselves into believing that. And so that could be an explanation for why they would bring this forward at this late date. Or it may be that, this is the way to implement it and leave it on the table for the next Republican administration, although I don't think that they care a great deal about the next Republican administration unless they're aiming to serve in it, which is a possibility. Or they could just be thinking, well, this is the way you would do it under normal circumstances, but we absolutely intend to go absolutely, crazy in the transition if Trump is to lose this election. So, okay. We'll see where he goes with that one. That's a sort of under the radar issue that I think we ought to bring up, and if we can prepare people for it ahead of time, good. So much the better. Let's see. There's another comment on it here from another Twitter feed from Avika Cohen, with whom I'm not familiar, but. I guess an attorney interested in this in some way. Let's see. He's responding to Andrew Feinberg from the, the White House reporter for The Hill. His discussion of the executive order, and I guess he's got the draft text of it issued from the office of the press secretary. So assuming it has been correctly transcribed, or that the final form of the executive order follows what was released from the press secretary, Feinberg's got the document and saying, Trump has signed an executive order which removes civil service protection from the large swath of positions of a confidential policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating character that don't turn over with each administration. Does he have more in the thread here? The order creates the Schedule F, of course, we heard about that. Important, he says at the end of his thread, this appears to be prospective, but would still cover a significant number of positions within government that are currently filled by tenured civil servants, but who Donald Trump would prefer to fire for being disloyal. He adds parenthetically here, see Fauci, Anthony. That's a possibility as well. Avika Cohen just adding his view to this. This is extraordinarily dangerous. It basically allows long-service federal government positions to be filled on a partisan rather than objective basis, and will make those positions no longer long service or career service positions. And that's certainly true. And let's see. I guess that's really all we can do with this one. I mean, we could read the order, but I don't know that really bears any fruit for us. Let's see. Speaking of what happens on the way out the door, I guess, let's take a look at Brian Beutler's perhaps latest and a concerning view of what happens at the end. Trump's corrupt legal endgame comes into view. A slightly different take on how to fight the results of the election that is very specific, but then therefore worthy of our time, since we love spending time in the weeds on the show. This is from yesterday's crooked.com. Trump's corrupt legal endgame comes into view. All right, we'll just read through it and discuss it as we go. That's kind of what we do on the show. President Trump has mused openly that he will challenge election results in court, and even that he'll likely prevail over and even that he's likely to prevail over the will of the public if the Senate hurriedly confirms his last-minute Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett. We've heard that scenario discussed as a possibility. This gets into some specifics, and I guess we're still on track for a Sunday confirmation vote there. So that'll happen before we speak again after the weekend. Trump's open flirtation with overturning the election and serving a second term at the behest of 5 right-wing Supreme Court justices has understandably invited his opponents to think through nightmare scenarios where he somehow manages to pull this off. But even the most grim conjectures tend to miss a key ingredient Trump and his allies would need to carry out a scheme like this: a pretext with a facially plausible legal basis for throwing out not just handfuls of ballots, but entire categories of them. This is an interesting play he describes here. In a recent alarming feature for The Atlantic, veteran investigative reporter Barton Gellman gamed out a scenario in which Trump and his GOP allies in battleground state legislatures simply bypass the vote count altogether and appoint pro-Trump electors as the Constitution empowers them to do. We discussed that piece. But even Gellman imagined that these Trump loyalists would have to act on the basis of lies, and only in the context of a very close race. With a justification based on claims of rampant fraud, he wrote, Trump would ask state legislatures to set aside the popular vote and exercise their power to choose a slate of electors directly. It would be a huge leap, legally and politically, to discard all the ballots in a state on the basis of a false claim, particularly when there's no mystery as to which presidential candidate won the most votes. But less than 2 weeks before Election Day, a remote but better grounded threat has come to the attention of campaign watchers, including some at high levels of the Democratic Party. It's a scenario in which Barrett and the 4 most conservative sitting justices align on decisions that make it impossible for states to finalize results in the first instance, placing any plans to throw the election to Trump-loyal GOP legislatures on firmer ground. Most voting rights supporters cheered this week's 4-4 Supreme Court decision to shelve a GOP challenge to Pennsylvania's extended absentee ballot deadline. We didn't do any cheering for it here. We worried about it. That decision leaves in place a state Supreme Court ruling that should allow Pennsylvania, remember Armando describing all this, should allow Pennsylvania to count ballots that arrive by November 6th, so long as they aren't postmarked after Election Day. In reaching that determination, the state court overrode state law to vindicate the state constitutional voting rights of Pennsylvanians, which have been threatened by pandemic conditions and intentional efforts to slow mail delivery. By the way, happened to just see during the show notice from the Hill that of a piece titled "Judge Orders Postal Service to Restore High-Speed Mail Sorting Machines." We don't have time to dive into exactly what that means, but I'll include that for your own reading over the weekend if necessary. So, where were we? Oh, yes, because of the mention of intentional efforts to slow mail delivery. But the fact that 4 sitting Supreme Court justices, this is what Armando was talking about, the fact that 4 sitting Supreme Court justices wanted to reach into Pennsylvania's affairs and possibly overturn that state court ruling troubled legal experts. They noted that the composition of the court will soon change, and Barrett will likely side with the 4 most conservative justices on legal challenges that Trump and the GOP might bring after the election, including to those late-arriving absentee ballots in Pennsylvania. There should be an easy remedy to this problem. Vote early, make your ballot impossible to challenge. That's wise advice that voters everywhere should follow, but in Pennsylvania, some ballots will, and everywhere, some ballots will inevitably arrive after Election Day. And the remote but terrifying risk is less that they'll be discarded than that the Supreme Court will declare them deficient after they've been commingled with a larger pool of unchallenged votes. You see what's happening here? With no way to distinguish valid, quote-unquote, valid ballots from the ones that the Supreme Court, including Barrett, has now invalidated, the state Republicans who spoke to Gelman would have the real actionable pretext that they need to declare the election tainted and seek to appoint electors who would loyally cast votes for Donald Trump. The missing pieces will fall into place. Is everybody clear on what they'd be talking about here? At the moment, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania's decision stands that ballots received by November 6th and not postmarked after November 3rd would be valid and okay to count along with everything else. So the ballot or the election workers would begin opening those ballots and processing them, at which point the Republicans in Pennsylvania might bring a complaint that they would appeal under emergency circumstances up to the Supreme Court and say that for I don't know, here we're still missing the pretext. What would be the pretext for saying that some of those ballots really shouldn't be counted? And the only pretext is, well, we only had 4 of you last time we asked this question. We're asking the question again now that we have 5 of you. And if Amy Coney Barrett says, yes, it doesn't make any sense that you would be appealing again since you've had your decision, but you have appealed, and here it is, and here's my chance. And guess what? I agree with the other 4. We should never have allowed the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision to extend the deadline to November 6th for receipt of those mail-in and absentee ballots. We should have said, nope, they have to be received by Election Day. And so all ballots that were received on November 4th, 5th, and 6th, even though they're postmarked the 3rd or earlier, are now invalid. But they've all been removed from their envelopes and mixed in with all of the mail-in votes. And we can now no longer tell which ones arrived on the 4th, 5th, and 6th. And the only thing we can do now is just to be safe, because those mail-in ballots, as we know, the president told us, are rife with fraud. The only thing we can do is excise all mail-in and absentee ballots so that none of the fraudulent ones get through. And the only thing that counts is the day of live voting or live in-person early voting. Could it happen? I guess it could. That's the pretext. It's worth noting, we'll continue with Beutler's writing here, at this juncture that any scheme like this would meet legal resistance and extraordinary political backlash. People would flood the streets. Democratic lawyers and voting rights lawyers would argue that throwing out entire categories of votes would violate the rights of voters who relied on the rules as they were written at the time of the election. Election law expert Rick Hasen likewise cautioned me that once ballots have been commingled, it is extremely unlikely that a court would do anything about it, particularly because parties know beforehand about this problem. So if you are the Trump campaign and you don't want ballots arriving after Election Day without a legible postmark to be counted somewhere, you've generally got to go to court and ask for those ballots to be separated before they are counted so that the matter can be remedied if a court later agrees. That would be the normal way of approaching things. There are a lot of things that are worrying me about the upcoming election, Hasten added, but the particular scenario you raised with me isn't at the top of my list. In other words, courts would have to be unabashed in their partisanship, they'd never do that, to help Trump pull this off. Lower courts, and ultimately the Supreme Court, would have to run roughshod over norms, no, not that, and the law to spoil ballots after they've already been stirred into the pot. And doing that would cashier whatever remains of their legitimacy in the public's eye. But this is a problem we've seen with GOP-dominated courts in less high-profile cases over and over again. If they're shameless enough, there's nothing to stop them. This concern about challenged ballots commingling with unchallenged ballots isn't limited to Pennsylvania and even raises the specter of Republicans engineering situations that allow them to circumvent vote counting by kettling absentee voters into submitting ballots in ways and at times that leaves them vulnerable to legal challenges, waiting until those ballots have been commingled with the rest, and then declaring it impossible to determine a legitimate winner. Last week, the General Counsel of the Florida Department of State issued guidance to elections officials, asserting that secure ballot drop boxes must be staffed by humans at all times. Scores of thousands of ballots have already passed through drop boxes that do not meet this criterion because it's new. It was imposed in the middle of the game, right? Slate legal writer Mark Joseph Stern noted that though this guidance lacks support in state law, it may nevertheless form the basis of a GOP legal challenge. Presuming supervisors ignore McVeigh's guidance, Florida's largest counties will collect a huge number of absentee ballots in a manner deemed unlawful by the Department of State, he writes. If Joe Biden narrowly wins the state in November, Florida's Republican-controlled government could argue that these ballots should be thrown out because they were cast through an illegal process. That claim could give rise to litigation that might allow the federal judiciary to call election results into question and invalidate ballots. As in Pennsylvania, though, the biggest risk may not be that Trump and the GOP will successfully challenge some ballots. It's that those invalid ballots will have been irretrievably commingled with unchallenged ones. Republicans wouldn't succeed in helping Trump throw out Democratic votes. They'd succeed in making a full count impossible. No doubt at this juncture, Republicans would crow that they and Trump had warned states and cities against vastly expanding absentee voting, but their I told you so's would be offered in bad faith. There would be nothing wrong with the challenged ballots other than the fact that Republicans believe invalidating them would help Trump hold on to power one way or another. They would be justifying the theft of an election on the grounds that officials and judges didn't foresee the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett when they set out to help citizens vote safely away from crowds as a deadly airborne virus plagues the nation. Indeed, the purpose of gaming out possible schemes like this, however unlikely they are to succeed, is to preempt them so they don't catch the public and the media unaware, and so they aren't mistaken for anything other than naked and illegitimate efforts to steal an election. Florida and Pennsylvania aren't the only states that Trump may target for having commingled challenged and unchallenged ballots, but together they would be pivotal. In theory, the state officials themselves could preempt this kind of chicanery by segregating out ballots in states like Pennsylvania that are likely to be challenged, or by declaring that voters in states like Florida will not be punished for following the rules. And even after adverse Supreme Court rulings, the political and legal battles over which candidate is entitled to contested state electoral votes would continue, particularly in states with Democratic administrations and Republican legislatures, including the key states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. Spokespeople for the Pennsylvania and Florida Secretaries of State did not respond to emailed questions before publication, But ultimately, the power to discredit Trump's underlying premise that partisan courts and free agent electors loyal to the president should dictate the winner of an election rests with engaged citizens. Trump and his supporters haven't committed to any particular species of legal challenge, but they have stood squarely behind the idea that his allies in the court should say which votes count and which votes don't, and that they should do so in a way that guarantees him a second term. It's ultimately voters, spurred to action by their leaders, who have the power to reject this premise by handing Trump a defeat outside the margin of litigation and by preparing to march peacefully day after day if and when he tries to disenfranchise them anyhow. The best way to help people to do that is to alert them in advance, what we're doing here, to what Trump's legal schemes might look like in practice. That's what we're doing.
From netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Have we alarmed you sufficiently? So remember, that's what we're supposed to be doing. Warning you ahead of time, frame his response before he can, so that the losses of two key advantages, the power to misleadingly shape public perception and the element of surprise, are taken from him. Stay tuned. Next, Justice Putnam will alarm you even further.